This is lesson 7 in our astronomy unit, and the title of this lesson is Exploration of the Moon. At the end of this lesson, you are going to be able to explain why the first trip to the moon was important. As always, we do have some vocabulary words you will have to be familiar with while you listen to this reading. The first is determined, committed to or forced on a decision or a goal. Disaster, a sudden and terrible event that is very unpleasant. Historic, famous or important in history, which are events of the past. Missions, tasks assigned to achieve set goals. And nervously, doing something in a worried or slightly frightened way. Last time we talked about the history of space exploration in itself. This time we're talking about the exploration of the moon. In 1961, the President of the United States, John F. Kennedy, announced that the United States would send astronauts to the moon within 10 years. Now, this seemed impossible to many people, but President Kennedy and the NASA scientists were determined to succeed. Thus, they started the Apollo program in order to send people to the moon. But there was a lot of hard work to be done before anyone could get anywhere near the moon. Surveyor 1 was the first spacecraft Americans sent to the moon, but it was an unmanned spacecraft. That is, it was a spacecraft without any people on it. The purpose of Surveyor 1 was to survey the moon's surface. It carried equipment to study the land, temperature, and other things NASA scientists needed to know before sending people to the moon. The Apollo program involved many missions. The first mission, Apollo 1, was a disaster. The spacecraft caught on fire before they had a chance to launch it. After that, however, the Apollo scientists had better success. First, there were unmanned missions to test various rockets and systems. This beautiful picture shows Apollo 4, an unmanned mission, no people aboard, to test a rocket engine. This is the type of engine that would eventually carry men to the moon. Next came manned missions. But these astronauts did not get to go to the moon. Instead, they were practicing and testing equipment to make sure everything would work properly. This photo shows the crew of the Apollo 7 mission. Finally, on July 16, 1969, Apollo 11 was launched from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. There were 3 astronauts aboard: Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Buzz Aldrin. This picture was taken shortly before they went on their historic mission. It took 4 days for Apollo 11 to travel the 239,000 miles from Earth to the moon. During the launch, the astronauts were sitting in the very top of the rocket. Once the rocket reached outer space, the part they were in broke off from the rest of the rocket and continued toward the moon. The rocket was not needed once the ship reached outer space. Michael Collins was the pilot for the command module, which drove the lunar module close to the moon but did not actually land there. The lunar module, called the Eagle, was attached to the command module during the journey from Earth to the moon. Once they got close enough to the moon, however, the Eagle broke off from the command module and landed on the surface. The Eagle orbited the moon as Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong prepared to descend and land on the surface. Meanwhile, as the Eagle approached the surface, hundreds of scientists back at Mission Control were watching from their computers very nervously to make sure everything went as planned. There is little room for error in space travel. The NASA scientists monitored every single part of the ship, making sure every fuse and every wire were working properly. At the same time, people all over America were glued to their television sets, also nervously waiting to see what would happen. The Eagle was equipped with television cameras, so everyone back home could see and hear everything that was happening 239,000 miles away on the moon. The moon landing excited people all over the world. It took a bit longer than expected, but finally Neil Armstrong announced the famous words, "The Eagle has landed." Great sighs of reliefs and cheers went up from mission control and in living rooms across America. Next, Neil Armstrong prepared to leave the Eagle and step out onto the moon. This picture shows what Americans back home saw on their television sets. As you can see, the picture was not very clear, but if you look closely, you can see Armstrong about to set foot on the moon's surface. Armstrong stepped down and landed on the fine, soft dust of the moon's surface. With his first step, he said, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." What did Neil Armstrong mean by this? He meant that he himself had taken a very small step from the Eagle's ladder and onto the moon, but that step represented a huge leap in terms of the advances humans had made by landing on the moon. Buzz Aldrin followed Armstrong down the ladder. Both astronauts wore special spacesuits designed to endure the harsh temperatures on the moon's surface. The astronauts conducted experiments to help future astronauts and scientists. The first thing that they noticed was their mobility, or how easy it was to walk and move around. The moon has very little gravity compared to Earth. Here on Earth, when you jump up, you just come straight back down. But that's not so on the moon. When you hop on the moon, you stay up there for a few seconds and you come down rather slowly. The astronauts collected samples of the moon's dust and rocks. Then they planted an American flag on the moon's soil. They had prepared the flag beforehand by inserting wires into it so that it would be firm and appear to be waving, even though there is no wind on the moon. 5 more Apollo missions landed successfully on the moon after that first mission. In the end, the Apollo astronauts brought back a total of 842 pounds of moon rocks. Many of these rocks are on display in museums around the world. Apollo 17, launched in 1972, was the very last mission to reach the moon. Nobody has returned to the moon since. That is bound to change as humans continue to explore outer space. In the previous lesson, we learned about the space race and how the US was in a race against the Soviet Union for space exploration. While the Soviet Union beat us to outer space, they definitely did not beat us to the moon. The Americans put the very first people on the moon. Neil Armstrong was the first person to step foot on the moon, making America the first country to land on the moon. So this was all about our moon exploration. If you need to refresh your memory on anything that happened in this lesson, please go back and do that now. When you are finished, please return to Seesaw and complete the activity for this lesson.